New International Version of the Bible. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law also came and muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus started to speak. He said, "There once was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together and had all he had and set off for a distant country, squandering all of the wealth he had been given in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the country he was in, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself to a man in that country who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine that was dead is alive again. He was lost and now is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I have slaved for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you haven't given me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost, but now is found.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So just from a show of hands, how many of you are an older sibling? The oldest. I am. Okay, good. How many of you are the youngest child in your family? Okay, good. Now, how many of you are an only child or a middle child who feel like you're more responsible than any of the other yahoos in your family? Good. There's a lot of honesty. That's great. Thank you, Jaden. Good. Thank you for participating in my survey. Most of you know that I have one sister who is 4 years younger than me. Her name is Sarah. And Sarah and I fit the roles of youngest child and oldest child as stereotypical as we possibly can. Like, we fit the mold. I am a hardworking, natural-born leader who cares way too much about what other people think. And Sarah is a laid-back, playful person who dances to the beat of her own drum. When we were younger and living in the same house, I coddled her along with my parents, always acting like a second mother. I made sure she was up and ready to get going for school. I made sure that her hair looked nice or it was braided. I made sure that no one was bullying her on the playground. But now that we're in our 30s, it's hard not to go into that like mother mode when I'm with her. She'll talk about her job or maybe a job she's applying to. She would talk about graduate school or a fight she'd recently got in with her fiance. And immediately, I would start to give her unsolicited advice. Drives her crazy every time. And I always feel bad when I realize I'm doing it because for like the first 10 minutes, I don't even realize I'm doing it. My relationship with my sister is so special to me, but it's also messy and hard to navigate at times. That's actually how all of the relationships are in my family. And my guess is that's probably the case for you too. The parable of the prodigal son is not just a parable about one person. It's a parable about a family, a father and his two sons. But before we dive into the parable, I think it's important to know who Jesus' original audience was when he spoke this parable. The gospel writer tells us that the tax collectors and sinners were gathered around to hear Jesus, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law also came to hear him. This tells us right away that the crowd Jesus had to teach was very diverse. These were people from opposite sides of the spectrum. He had the outcasts, the misfits, the immoral, and he also had the righteous, hardworking, and religious elite. All of them were listening. So Jesus begins to tell them a parable about a father with two sons. Let's talk about the younger son first. This young man goes to his father and demands his share of the estate. He wants his half of the inheritance. Now, a son would receive his share of the inheritance only after the father had died, so a request of this nature would have been incredibly disrespectful. It would have been like saying, I wish you were dead, so give me what is mine. I'm done with you, and I'm done with this family. And while Christ's original audience would have been shocked to hear the son reject his family in this way and disrespect his father, what was even more shocking was the fact that the father granted his son's request. So the young man goes off with his portion of the inheritance, and he squanders all of it, every single penny, hitting rock bottom, starting to work for a pig farmer, which was a huge no-no, right, as a Jewish person, unclean animals, and ends up starving in a foreign land. And in the midst of his suffering, he thinks about home and how his father's servants always had more than enough to eat. So he decides to go back home, and he's going to tell his dad, Father, look, I messed up. I sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be your son, so just make me like one of the hired help. I can picture the son walking along the path and rehearsing this speech over and over because I have done this. There have been many times when I have messed up big time and been on my way home rehearsing an apology in my head to say to my parents. Well, while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him in the distance and wasn't angry. He didn't shame him. He didn't slam the door and lock all of the doors and windows. He was filled with compassion for him. He ran out to meet his son, throwing his arms around him and kissing him. And I can just picture in the middle of this rehearsed apology, it's almost like the father interrupts with joy and says to the servants, quick, quick, none of that, none of that. Put the best robe on my son, a ring on his finger, and let us kill the fattened calf. He was so excited to celebrate that his son had been found. Now, this story is not going in a way that anyone would have ever expected. The son heads home, contrite and brokenhearted, prepared to beg his father for mercy. Everyone expects the father to be angry, but instead, his reaction is joy. And he gives him the best robe, which actually, at that time, would have been his, the father's robe. The clothing in the family that symbolizes the patriarch. And he says, give him a ring, which symbolizes a reunion back into the family. And when he suggests to kill the fattened calf, this was essentially like, let's open that 50-year-old bottle of vintage wine that could go for $1,000. This is a very special reason to celebrate. You see, meat wasn't something that people had every day back then, and so it really was something only to be shared at a special occasion, and a fattened calf would have been enough, not just for the family, but for the entire community to feast on for a week. I love this. And Russ actually has a special bottle of whiskey that he only opens for very special occasions. And so we talked about that last night. But what we also talked about was how we wouldn't open that bottle of whiskey if, I don't know, our kid came home and said that they totaled the car and it was their fault because they were texting. Or our child came home and said, hey, I just want to let you know I failed out of college and I burned the admissions place down, so we're going to have to pay for that. It's usually not the time that we like pop the champagne and get out the banners and the cake, right? But that's exactly what the Father does in this parable, which is why it's so radical and scandalous. The Son admits he messed up. And the Father responds, let us celebrate because you're back. We call this the parable of the prodigal son, and because of this, I think most of us have assumed that we knew what that word prodigal means. I must confess that up until this week, I thought prodigal meant repenting of your wrongdoings and returning home. I just kind of did because of this story. But as we read in the prayer of confession, and as we know, that's not what it means. Prodigal actually means spending a lavish amount of money or resources freely and recklessly, being wastefully extravagant, lavish, and even illogical. So we call the younger son the prodigal because he was recklessly extravagant with his inheritance. But who else was recklessly extravagant in the story? Who spends everything he has to show compassion, love, and grace to his child? It's the Father. Even though the younger son loses everything, the Father responds with nothing but the best for him. And what this tells us about the Father is that his acceptance and love is not contingent upon our actions or a specific, well-rehearsed apology. There's nothing the Son can do to earn the Father's love. It's already given. It's simply a free gift that's already there. The story most of times ends there, but it doesn't really. A lot of times preachers really focus on the younger son and kind of neglect the older. But remember, the Father had two sons. So Jesus goes on to tell us that the older brother wasn't too happy about this celebration happening, right? He comes home from working hard in the fields and hears a party is going on for his irresponsible screw up of a younger brother. And this leaves him bitter and furious. So he decides he's going to disgrace his dad too by rejecting his father's invitation to the party and refusing to enter the family home. Just like asking your father for your inheritance before he died, rejecting an invitation from the patriarch of the family would have been incredibly disrespectful behavior at the time. But instead of reacting in anger or shame, the father goes out yet again to meet the older son, urging him to come home and join in on the celebration. The older brother says, Father, all of these years I've slaved for you. I've done everything you've asked, and not once have I ever gotten a goat to celebrate with my friends. But there is only lavish, radical grace. The father replies and says, Son, you have always been with me, and everything I have is yours. All of this has always been yours. Don't you get that? And at this point of the story, I think it's important for us to recognize that it wasn't just one of the sons that was lost. Both of them were. Both of them were separated from their father. One might have been geographically lost, but the other one was emotionally and spiritually lost. The younger son was lost because of his selfishness and greed. He lost everything. But the older son was lost too. He was estranged by his self-righteousness and lost in his legalism. He thought he deserved more favor, more grace, more love than the younger brother because of all of the works that he had done. Neither son wanted a relationship with the father. They just wanted what the father had to give. They wanted his stuff. And both sons believed the father saw them based off of their actions and behavior. One responded in shame and guilt, the other one in self-righteousness and entitlement. Both not wanting what the father ultimately wanted, which was a loving relationship. This was an incredibly provocative parable for Jesus to tell the crowd that day because his audience was filled with the lost prodigals, the younger sons and the older ones. Both lost, both offered God's extravagant grace. Now, parables are designed to make us critically think, and so this morning I wonder, which son do you most resonate with? Where do you find yourself in the story? Are you the one who's the older brother, who's always been good, always playing by the rules, never straying from the path, and you think deep down that God owes you more than what you've been given? You struggle with bitterness and resentment. Or do you resonate more with the younger son, the one who's run away and rebelled and is now back? You see yourself as the black sheep, the one who is ashamed because of all they have done and where they have been. Well, I've got to be honest this morning, the description of the older brother just fits me to a T. I have always tried to please God to the best of my ability, and there are times when I get lost in a sea of self-righteousness and judgment towards people who are not living the way I believe they should. I find myself reading this parable, wondering what happened at the end of the story. Did the older brother go in and join the party? Did the two brothers reconcile? Well, remember, the point of the parables was not to tie everything up in a bow. It wasn't to give us a happy ending. It actually was supposed to make us uncomfortable, to challenge us, to hold up a mirror to our own lives and our own stories. And so this morning, I ask you, what's a situation in your life that could use some prodigal love and grace? Who do you long to be reconciled with? This week, I would encourage you to be extravagantly brave and grace-filled, and to reach out with the one you've been estranged with, to rekindle a relationship that's been lost to you that could be rebirthed. Now, I'm not suggesting to enter back into any unhealthy relationships that were abusive or toxic. Healthy boundaries are good, and it's important for us to set them. But what I am talking about is how too often loved ones go for years and years without talking because of a stupid fight. It makes me think of one of my favorite movies, Home Alone, from the 1990s. You know, I know it's not Christmas time, but I'm the pastor and I can do what I want. So in the movie, 8-year-old Kevin McAllister comes into the church and is sitting down, listening to the choir rehearse. And he sees his scary neighbor, Old Man Marley, sitting alone in the pew. And so Kevin and Marley begin to talk, and they finally confess to each other the real reason they're there on Christmas Eve in the afternoon. Marley says that he's there because he wanted to hear his granddaughter sing, but he knew he wasn't welcome at the Christmas Eve service because of his relationship with his son. He goes on to tell Kevin that he is estranged from his son, and he can't even remember why, but years ago they had gotten in a fight, and they said to each other, "I don't want to talk to you anymore. I don't want to see you." But Kevin, as an 8-year-old, sees the pain behind Marley's eyes, and he says, "Well, if you miss your son, why don't you just call him?" And Marley says what too many of us do. "I'm afraid if I call him, he won't answer. I'm afraid of what will happen." And so Kevin, of course, goes on to say, "Well, I understand, I'm afraid of things too. But I think when you're afraid of things, it's important to face them. So why don't you call your son? The worst thing is that he won't answer. But at least then you'll know, and you won't have to be afraid anymore." You see, too many of us allow pride and stubbornness and fear get in the way of reconciliation that God so desperately wants in our lives. This story and parable is about reconciliation with God, our Father, but it's also an invitation to be reconciled with each other. And the beautiful thing about the gospel is that Christ brings transformation and healing in so many ways. And one of those ways is in community. So this morning, receive the lavish, reckless, prodigal grace that God has for you. And be reminded that there is no limit to the grace we experience with God, because God is a God of no limits. Our lives are big, messy, full, and complicated, but God's grace will always meet us wherever we're at. So may we go forward full to the brim with that same grace, loved ones. Amen. At this time, you are invited to give your tithes and your offerings to the mission and ministry of Hope United Methodist Church. For those of you worshiping with us online, you are invited to give online at hopeumcbillings.org, on Venmo at hopeumc, or by mailing a check to P.O. Box 50066, zip code 59105. At this time, until Easter Sunday, we will not be passing the plate for those of you who are worshiping with us in person, but we will have a physical plate at the end as you exit the sanctuary, and a physical plate up front, so 2 of them that you can put check and cash in. I want to thank you all so much for the generosity that you show this congregation. Because of what we do, we are able to advance the kingdom of God and bring heaven to earth every single day in our children's programs, in our youth programs, in our music, and in our worship, in our community outreach, in the ways that we love our neighbors. And it is all because we come together, and together we can do so much. So, Jaden, you are invited to bless us with the music this morning.